Another thing that's part of the thing my own research concentrates about is growing boundary spanners who can build micro-communities across boundaries. What I mean here is that I think I've heard in the pharmaceutical context, it's getting that Japanese, oh no, I believe it wasn't winning the Deming Award, getting the Japanese expert in and learning from him. And I was talking to Jeffrey, unfortunately he left, but he was saying at GM, you learn the hard ways that the only way to build these global competencies is to move people, is for him to be on the plane, half of the days in the year. So, and these people one person's not going to be able to be this great leader and build this whole big culture. It takes a lot of them to build the micro communities across some of these boundaries. And I think people talked about information systems, the importance of investing in IT. And so where does this fall in this whole integration across boundaries theme? And I think that it actually falls in the same line as creating a common language and a common set of terms, what we call, the company lingo. And that is connecting community members and helping them to communicate and reproduce what we got. If a company knows customers really well, like GM, how are they going to reproduce it if we have employee turnover? So that's where you have to have something encoded, something CMM5. And we know that this is not perfect. There are problems with this kind of way. But it's when people leave, you have to have something that sticks and is still out there. And finally, this is all about integration across the boundaries that you choose to integrate across, whether globally or professionally or otherwise. But if to do it dynamically in a changing environment, you have to throw in this reflection business. You have to continuously reflect on how you do it, and as the environment change, not to be in the strategic rigidity situations that we know about. So to conclude my remarks, I know that in hallways, a lot of the discussion has been not so much here in the open about, well, does the culture matter? And honestly, I started this research on global sourcing with a question of how does the culture matter? I come originally from Russia. I lived in the United States for half of my life, and I hear people in the US talking about offshoring and working with Indian providers, working with Indian programmers, and everybody says it's a culture business, the culture is different, it's difficult to work with this culture or that culture. I go to these countries and ask them, tell me about the problems you're experiencing. And actually, honestly, sometimes we both, myself and the respondent, fall asleep because, not in all interviews, some of them are wonderful, but I'm saying because the problems people experience working in India or Russia, I find are exactly the same as problems we experience working in the United States. Like for IT, it would be, we can't get clear requirements from the users. The scope keeps changing. So I say, okay, tell me cultural, and they don't get to that cultural. Now, does it say that the culture does not matter? I don't think that's true. Having myself gone through cultural shock of moving to the United States, I think culture matters. But I think the key question to ask when you do business globally, when you talk about global competitiveness, is when the culture matters. When the national culture matters, and when it's the organizational culture that matters, when is it professional culture that matters. So that's just a thought to leave you all with. I know everybody here probably knows culture matters at some level, and it's a wonderful culture that you have, and it's worth understanding, but it's not the key thing when you do this business globally. It plays a role in different places.
Thank you. You can speak very well. You're going to be provocative, right?
Okay, thank you, Ajit. I will not attempt to summarize the discussions. I think each one of us can do it better for ourselves. What I will do is probably raise some issues that may not have been raised as specifically as I thought they might have been. The first thing is about a frame. When we talk about Indian manufacturing competitiveness, there is this whole issue of what, within the Indian context, the governments can do and what the firms can do. Typically in the West, what governments can do or cannot do is largely irrelevant. Unfortunately, that's not true in India, and I think Professor Vishwanathan briefly referred to it. If you see the reports of FICCI or CII or any of the industry associations in India, or even some of the reports released by Accenture, and I think even Deloitte touched upon it briefly, and some of the other international consulting companies regarding issues in India, some themes very clearly come out, which is the role of the government, particularly on 3 or 4 issues. One is the whole policy framework. How many companies do you allow, how much of foreign direct investment you allow or you don't allow, and trade tariffs and all that kind of stuff. Then the whole issue of regulation. The people have been talking about the bureaucracy and the red tape and the inspector Raj and the kind of transaction costs that businesses have to deal with in dealing with the government. Then the whole issue of, I think that was also referred to briefly, the fiscal and financial issues, again related to taxes and foreign exchange rates and subsidies and incentives and so on, and reservation for small-scale sector and how that distorts the. Now, if you read the industry, I'm just mentioning what is a research agenda that's possible for us here as a network of, I think, research partners around the globe sitting right here. I think those arguments, the output of the industry associations are more like lobbying. I think we need a little bit of more nuanced studies on that, on what exactly we can, how to influence the government on some of those issues. And I would just ask one provocative question to the industry here that, when they ask for all kinds of concessions, if you read those reports, they're saying reduce taxes, give me this concession, give me that concession. Does policy follow performance of the industry or vice versa? So that's a question that, the idea behind it is that if industry has some strong performance to back it up and then goes to the government for some policy changes, are they more likely to listen in that context? The next set of issues is what firms themselves can do, and I certainly will not speak about that because lots of speakers have spoken rather eloquently on what firms should be doing to make themselves more competitive. I think we've had a very rich discussion on that. But as a research network, if I may use the word, I think there are some issues that we may like to think about, in addition to the excellent suggestions that have come earlier. One is that in a fast-changing, dynamic world where markets and technologies are changing very, very rapidly, what can we as thinkers, what insights do we provide on how we should do business and particularly manufacturing in such a context? Because things are changing very, very rapidly, and I'm not aware of any insightful research that asks this question, that how do we operate in a very dynamic environment where change is the sort of law of nature, if I may say, and the rate of change is increasing very, very fast. In the Indian context particularly, another issue I think that we might like to research on is how do we develop leaders in manufacturing? Actually, I'm just taking a word out of an MIT program called Leaders in Manufacturing, which someone just told me has closed down apparently. But be that as it may, some of the forward-thinking companies in India outside manufacturing, for example, Infosys has a Leadership Development Institute in Mysore. And I think if as researchers and thinkers, if we can think of a way of developing leaders in manufacturing, they will take care of all the things that we have been talking about, how to globalize, how to synchronize, because, with a little bit of support from us. So we need to have some research on developing leaders in manufacturing. Now, this whole issue of Indian labor productivity and low cost, it has always intrigued me ever since I came back to India. On the one hand, study after study shows us that in many sectors, the productivity of Indian labor is not so good. Cost, of course, is very low, which is an advantage, and in many cases, the low cost seems to sort of balance out the low productivity. But on the other hand, if you see, and I travel a lot within this country, right here in the state of Andhra Pradesh, we have the largest handloom weaving sector in the country. Incredibly skilled men and women, churning out fantastic garments. And you can, some of you are interested, you can just go into Hyderabad, go to Kalanjali and all these places and buy them. Temples, I'm not talking about ancient temples, I'm talking about temples being built today. Sthapatis are building fantastic sculpted temples even today. Handicrafts, a bunch of pottery. The point I'm making is that traditionally in India, there is an incredible amount of skill. We are not able to tap that skill and translate that into modern manufacturing paradigms. I think there is a big gap there. I would actually suggest that this is a research topic that we need to sort of really seriously consider, because I don't accept as an Indian that we are not a skilled population. We are a skilled population. Somehow we are not able to use that skill productively and sort of economically to our advantage. Jewelry is another issue. Jewelry is now picking up, but a lot of fine skill work is done even in the jewelry trade. One issue which is slightly off the wall is, breakthrough versus innovative manufacturing. I think a lot has been talked about in the past, and I think the gentleman from Tata's, what's his name, Mr. Sumantran, yeah, he gave a very eloquent presentation, and he was, to my way of thinking, not really talking about a breakthrough, but an incremental innovative approach of going from step to step and ultimately competing in developed markets. And he talked about a car which is big inside but small outside, and then he talked about their approach towards manufacturing, where they said that how do they bring skeletons of robots from Sweden and then engineer them within the company, and then therefore they're able to have a 6% cost advantage over something that China would do, and so on and so forth. So that's the innovative approach. And then, of course, there has been no breakthrough within India that I am aware of. But a parallel is the whole Toyota manufacturing system and lean manufacturing. I think if you look at the role of academia particularly, and maybe even the consultants, we have a role in articulating a vision. If you look at this lean manufacturing, it was innovated by somebody, Taichi Ono and Toyota and so on, but the articulation of that paradigm and then its subsequent dissemination, I think it had a significant role to play in spreading the message of lean manufacturing, if you may call it, around the world. And I think we have to think a couple of steps ahead right here and see what are likely emerging paradigms and articulate them properly. I'm not saying just talking about a buzzword like lean manufacturing or agile manufacturing or nimble manufacturing. But I was searching for a word when Mr. Sumantran was talking. I don't know whether it is creative or innovative or value for money manufacturing or what it is. But in the Indian context, because we don't have the money to invest, at the same time we have to be innovative to compete in the international world, I suspect that somewhere some breakthrough is going to come. And if we can anticipate that and articulate it and capture it properly, we would play a significant role in actually making Indian manufacturing competitive. So I think that's all I had to really say. One last point, which I would really agree with Professor Vishwanathan when he was talking about the food process industry and a lot of other things that we don't really look at carefully while we are talking about this whole business of manufacturing. And how do we turn our low-cost labor advantage into a really competitive advantage? So are there industries out there? For example, the World Trade shows that, some of the reports show there's 1.5 trillion labor-intensive world trade out there, of which India has only less than 1% or something like that. And even relatively high-cost labor countries like South Korea and others have an advantage over India on that. So what are the opportunities for us to sort of grow in that direction? Because it would kill two birds with one stone. You become internationally competitive, you have economic growth, and then since it's labor intensive, you also provide jobs to a lot of people. So thank you, Ajit, for this opportunity, and thanks to all of you for your patience.
Thank you, Shalaji. Ira, I'll turn to you, but I'm going to also pose one of the questions that Trilochan set up, which was, you said, does policy follow performance, or does performance follow policy, right? He was asking whether industry, when it lobbies for brakes, is there any evidence one way or the other?
Well, I think that performance generally follows policy, and policy makes a big difference. And is this my time?
Yep,
okay.
it's your time.
I do have a few thoughts just, which are related to that. And I'd like to say a few words about China, because I've been following China and visiting there a lot over the past 2 years. And a lot of people ask, well, who's going to win this race, China or India? And the answer is neither and both, because it's not really a race. And globalization is not a zero-sum game. It's not a game. It's simply the gains of any individual country are not at the expense of another. The gains of any individual country can actually benefit other countries. So I think that both China and India are going to do well. It's probably the case that India won't grow as fast as China in the next few years for a number of reasons, but that's not cause for concern, because as long as India grows reasonably fast, India will become a richer country and a more successful one. But getting to manufacturing,